Clara rode the mare into what passed for a town with the sun bleeding out behind the peaks. The place was little more than a suppurating wound in the valley. 10 or 12 raw pine buildings leaning against each other for support. The wind, which never stopped in this part of Wyoming, tasted of dust and endings. She kept her head down. The brim of her stained hat pulled low, but her eyes missed nothing. Every man who watched her pass was a threat. Every curtain that twitched in a grimy window was an eye she did not trust. She was on the run. That was the simple, hard truth of it. Winter was coming, a wolf snarling at her heels, and she was running from other wolves. The two-legged kind. She needed supplies. Flour, coffee, salt, cartridges for the Winchester she kept under her knee. She had a list in her head, pared down to the bone. Survival. That was all that mattered now. She swung down from the mare, her movement stiff. She ignored the ache in her back and the burning in her thighs. The livery stable smelled of old hay and manure. She paid the man in coin, her voice flat, telling him 1 hour. He grunted, his eyes lingering on her face a moment too long. Clara turned away, her hand moving, by instinct, to the revolver holstered on her hip. The man's eyes dropped. At the general store, she was all business. She moved through the cluttered aisles, grabbing what she needed, stacking it on the counter. She felt the storekeeper's gaze on her, assessing. A woman alone. That was always a question out here. Was she a widow, a whore, or just lost? Clara offered him nothing. Her face was a mask carved from granite. "That'll be $3.50, Mom," the man said, his voice oily. She counted out the coins, each one a small piece of the freedom she was hoarding. She didn't have much left. Just enough to get her to the cabin she'd heard about. A place high in the Laramie Range. A place where the snow fell 20 feet deep and no one would think to look for her. A place to bury herself until spring. "Heavy load," the storekeeper offered, trying to draw her out. "I can manage." Her words were sharp, a blade to cut the thread of conversation. She loaded her supplies into her saddlebags, her movements efficient. She did not want to spend one more minute in this town. The air felt wrong. Too many eyes. She felt the prickle on her neck, the same one she'd felt for 2 months, the feeling of being hunted. She led the mare out of the livery, mounted up, and didn't look back. She pushed the horse hard, urging it toward the foothills, toward the narrow, winding trail that led up into the high country. The sun was gone now, and the sky was a deep, bruised purple. The clouds were massing in the west, heavy and dark, promising the first hard freeze of the season. She had to beat it. The path was treacherous, barely wide enough for a single horse, with a sheer drop on the left that fell away into a canyon choked with pine. The wind howled up from the darkness, pushing at her, trying to peel her from the saddle. The mare whickered, nervous, her hooves slipping on the loose shale. "Easy, girl," Clara murmured, her voice tight with tension. "Just a little further." She was racing the storm, racing the men she was sure were behind her, racing the memory of her husband's face. She rounded a blind corner. A sharp switchback carved into the rock. It happened too fast for a scream. One moment there was just the trail and the wind. The next, there was the sudden, terrified sound of another horse, a dark shape looming out of the dusk. A man's shouted curse. Her mare reared, screaming, as it collided with the other animal. There was a sickening crash of leather and horseflesh. Clara was thrown, ripped from the saddle as if by a giant hand. She hit the ground hard, the air exploding from her lungs. She rolled, gravel tearing at her hands and face, her body slamming against the rocky inner wall of the trail. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up from her left ankle. She cried out, a sharp, broken sound that was stolen by the wind. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind, the frantic scrambling of the horses as they found their feet, and the groan of a man. Dust settled. Clara pushed herself up onto her elbows, her vision swimming, her ankles screamed. Through the haze of pain, she saw him, a man, untangling himself from his own mount. He got to his feet slowly, methodically. He was big, a shadow against the dying light. He moved to his horse first, his hands running over its legs, calming it with a low murmur. Then he checked her mare. Only when he was satisfied the animals were sound did he turn to her. He walked over, his boots crunching on the shale. He stopped a few feet away. She could see him better now. A hard face, weathered deep by sun and wind, a thick beard that needed trimming, and his eyes, they were the color of a winter sky, cold and empty, and they looked as if they had seen too much. "You all right, ma'am?" His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. Clara dragged herself to a sitting position, biting her lip against the wave of nausea that rolled over her. She tried to get her legs under her, to stand. The moment she put weight on her left foot, a black wave of agony washed over her. She collapsed back with a sharp intake of breath. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice shaking. He didn't move. He just watched her. Ankles busted, or close to it. He wasn't wrong. She could feel the sickening, loose grate of bone. He stepped forward, offering a hand. It was a large hand, gloved and scarred. Clara flinched, dragging herself backward. "Don't touch me. I don't need your help." The man stopped. He looked at her, his gaze flat, unreadable. Then he looked up at the sky. The first stinging pellets of sleet struck his face. The wind rose to a shriek, a physical force that battered them. The temperature was dropping so fast she could feel the blood retreating from her skin. "Suit yourself," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He turned back to his horse. "Wait," Clara said, her voice small. She hated the weakness in it. You can't leave me." He looked back at her. "I'm not, but we stay here. We're dead by morning. Both of us." He nodded up the trail, to a place she hadn't seen, a dark break in the trees. "There's a way station, old, abandoned, about a quarter mile up. We can make it there." He didn't offer his hand again. He just waited. Clara knew he was right. The storm was on them, a wall of ice and fury. She would freeze to death before anyone found her. Gritting her teeth, she tried to stand again, this time using the rock wall for support. The pain was so intense it made her dizzy, but she got to her good foot. He watched her, his expression unchanged. He walked over, and before she could protest, he bent, slid one arm under her legs and the other around her back, and lifted her as if she weighed nothing. "Put me down," she yelled, struggling, beating at his chest with her fists. He didn't even grunt. He just held on, his grip like a steel trap. "Stop fighting me, woman. You want to live or not?" He carried her to his horse, a big roan that stood like a rock, and somehow, with her fighting him and the wind trying to tear them apart, he got her settled in his saddle. He swung up behind her, his body a solid, unwelcome wall at her back. He wrapped one arm around her waist, holding her in place. "My horse," she said, her teeth chattering. "She'll follow," he grunted. He grabbed the reins of her mare, clicked his tongue, and the roan started moving, climbing the treacherous path in the gathering dark. Clara was rigid, trapped between the man and the storm. His body was hard, and she could feel the cold radiating off his canvas coat. But beneath the cold, there was a deep, unsettling warmth. She hated him for touching her. She hated herself for the small, traitorous part of her that was grateful not to be alone in the ice. The way station was barely standing. It was a one-room log cabin, sagging in the middle, its roof half caved in, but it had 4 walls and a stone chimney. Silas, though she did not know his name then, pushed the warped door open with his boot. It groaned in protest. He slid from the horse, then reached up and hauled her down, his hands impersonal and strong. He half carried, half dragged her inside, dumping her unceremoniously on the dirt floor before turning to tend to the horses. He led them into a rickety lean-to attached to the cabin's side. A poor shelter, but better than nothing. Clara sat in the darkness, shivering, her ankle a universe of pain. The cabin smelled of rat droppings, old rot, and damp. Wind screamed through the 1,000 cracks in the walls. He came back inside, shoving the door closed. The sound of the storm was muffled, but it was still a living, roaring thing just outside. He moved past her without a word, his spurs ringing softly on the floorboards. She watched his silhouette as he knelt at the fireplace. There was a small, dry stack of wood left by some long-gone traveler. He worked with an economy of motion, striking a match, feeding the tiny flame with tinder. He didn't look at her. "Get those wet things off before you freeze," he ordered, his back to her. She bristled. "I will not." He sighed, a rough sound. "Ma'am, I don't give a damn about your modesty. But if that cold settles in, you'll lose more than your ankle. I'm not cutting off black rotted feet come morning. Now get 'em off." He kept his back to her, focusing on the fire. Clara hesitated. Her clothes were soaked, and the cold was a physical ache in her bones. She was shivering so hard her teeth rattled, cursing him, cursing the storm, cursing her life. She fumbled with the buttons on her coat. Her fingers were numb. She shed her heavy canvas coat, then her wet wool shirt, until she was down to her thin chemise. She immediately wrapped her bedroll, which he'd pulled from her mare, around her shoulders. It was damp, but it was something. She heard him moving, stripping off his own wet outer layers. She kept her eyes fixed on the small, growing fire. The room was cast in flickering, unreliable light. They were two strangers, trapped in a box, surrounded by a howling wilderness. She could feel his presence on the other side of the small room. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, and he moved with a quiet, dangerous grace. He was a threat. Everything about him screamed it. The fire caught, and he sat back on his heels. He still hadn't looked at her. He'd wrapped his own blanket around his waist. They sat on opposite sides of the room, two damp, shivering bundles in the dark. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind. Clara stared into the flames, and the heat pulled the memory from her. It was always there, waiting just beneath the surface. Arthur, her husband. He'd had a smile that could charm a snake, and hands that were too quick with a deck of cards, and, later, with her, he'd gambled away their small farm in Nebraska, piece by piece. So they'd come west, to Wyoming, for a new start, but it was just a new place for the same old troubles. He found a new game, this time for land. He'd played against a man named Nolan Clay, a cattle baron who owned half the territory and wanted the other half. Arthur had lost, of course. He always lost. And then, one night, he'd ridden out to settle his marker and never came back. They'd found him 2 days later at the bottom of a ravine, his horse still standing nearby. A tragic accident, the sheriff had said. Clara knew better. 2 days after the funeral, Nolan Clay himself had come to her homestead. He was a polite man, soft-spoken, with pale, dead eyes. He'd offered his condolences, and then he'd told her that Arthur's debt, a staggering sum, $500, was now hers. He'd been very reasonable. She could sign the deed to her land over to him, and the debt would be forgotten. She'd refused. The land was all she had. Clay had smiled, a thin, patient smile. He'd given her 1 week. Clara had packed her mare that night. She'd been riding for 2 months, sleeping in ditches, avoiding towns, always looking over her shoulder. She was collateral. That's what he'd called her. She shivered, and this time, it had nothing to do with the cold. A log popped in the fire, sending a shower of sparks. It pulled her back. The man was looking at her. His gaze was intense, analytical. "You're bleedin'," he said. Clara looked down. He was right. Her hand, the one she'd landed on, was scraped raw, and a thin trickle of blood ran down her wrist. She hadn't even felt it. He pushed himself up and went to his saddlebag. He pulled out a strip of clean cloth and a small flask of whiskey. He walked over to her, his movements slow, deliberate, as if approaching a spooked horse. He knelt in front of her. The firelight played on the hard planes of his face. "This'll hurt," he said. He didn't offer the flask for drinking. He uncorked it and poured a stream of amber liquid directly onto her hand. Clara hissed, the sting so sharp it felt like fire, but she didn't pull away. He wrapped the cloth around her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. His fingers were calloused and rough, but his movements were steady. Then his eyes went to her ankle. It was already swollen, a dark, ugly knot beneath the hem of her denims. That needs settin', or at least bindin'. She just nodded, exhausted. The fight was gone, frozen out of her. He worked with the same impersonal efficiency. He cut a strip from his own bedroll. "Brace yourself." He took her ankle in his hands. His grip was firm. He pulled, a short, violent jerk. Clara screamed, a raw sound torn from her throat. Black spots danced in front of her eyes. He didn't apologize. He just wrapped the ankle, binding it tight, using 2 pieces of kindling as a crude splint. "It'll hold," he said, his voice flat, "till the storm passes." He retreated to his side of the fire. He didn't give his name. She didn't offer hers. They were nothing to each other. Hours passed. The storm raged, a primal fury that shook the small cabin to its foundations. Sleet hammered the roof, and the wind moaned like a dying animal. They sat in silence. Clara's ankle throbbed with a dull, heavy beat, but the whiskey and the pain had numbed her. Eventually, the man's breathing deepened. He dozed, sitting upright against the wall, his rifle resting across his lap. His guard was down, but not by much. Clara stayed awake, watching him. She didn't trust him. She couldn't afford to trust anyone. But he hadn't hurt her. He'd helped her. The contradiction was a knot in her stomach. Then he began to mutter. It was low at first, thick with sleep and some deep, buried pain. "Eliza," he mumbled. "A woman's name. No, God, no, put it down." His body tensed, his hand gripping the rifle. "The shot, blood, it wasn't, oh, God." He jerked awake, his eyes flying open, wild and haunted. He was breathing hard, a sheen of sweat on his face despite the cold. He scanned the dark corners of the room, his hand white-knuckling the rifle. His gaze landed on her. He saw her watching him, saw the knowledge in her eyes. His face closed up instantly, becoming a mask of stone. He looked away, staring into the dying embers of the fire. He said nothing. He didn't excuse himself, didn't explain. He just sat there, breathing, and the guilt coming off him was so thick she could almost taste it. The silence was heavier now, freighted with the ghosts he'd brought into the room. The storm screamed, as if trying to get in, as if it knew 2 broken souls were hiding inside. Clara found her voice. It was hoarse, raspy. "You running from something?" she asked, the words out before she could stop them. "Or just running?" He turned his head and looked at her. It was a long, hard look, and she felt it to her bones. "Does it matter?" he finally asked. "Everyone's running from something out here," she said, the words aimed more at herself than at him. "This land, it don't care what you were, only what you are, and what you can take." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on her. "It takes 2, he said, his voice low. "It takes everything you've got. If you let it." He poked the fire with a stick, sending a fresh burst of sparks up the chimney. "Stampede down in Texas. Lost a whole herd. 3 men. Watched a man I knew for 10 years get crushed. Nothing left but a red stain. That's what this land does." He spoke of cattle and men. But Clara heard something else. He was talking about loss, about the guilt he'd woken up with. She found herself answering, her own story rising to the surface. Not the true one, but a piece of it. "Had a farm back in Nebraska," she said, her voice quiet. "Drought? Took the corn, took the wheat, took everything. Nothing left but dust. You watch a year's work blow away on the wind? It changes you." They traded these small, hard truths like currency. He talked about a winter in the Bighorns that cost him 2 toes to frostbite. She talked about the loneliness of a Wyoming homestead, where the silence was so loud it rang in your ears, where you could go a month without seeing another human soul. They were stories of survival, of betrayal by the land, by the sky, by life itself. Each story was a piece of themselves, offered up as a test. "Do you understand this? Can you see my pain?" The fire burned low, and the cabin grew cold. The chill was deep, seeping into their bones, a cold that came from the ground up. But the small space between them, the few feet of dirt floor, felt hot. It was a charged, restless energy. The heat of two bodies. The friction of two damaged souls pressed together by the storm. He looked at her, and his eyes weren't empty anymore. They were just tired, bone-tired. And she saw something else in them. Recognition. He was looking at her, and he was seeing himself. He made a small move, just a slight shift of his body, as if he meant to offer his bedroll, to share his warmth. It was a small gesture, an unconscious offer of comfort. Clara saw it, and it terrified her more than the storm, more than the men hunting her, more than the man sitting across from her. Vulnerability. Trust. Those were words that got you killed. She turned away from him sharply, pulling her own ragged blanket tighter around her shoulders. She curled up on the hard, cold floorboards, her back to him, her face to the wall. Her sprained ankle throbbed, a dull, miserable ache, and her heart pounded a heavy, lonely beat against her ribs. She would not be weak. She would not trust. She would not. She closed her eyes and prayed for morning. Morning came not with light, but with a dull, gray lessening of the dark. Clara woke stiff and cold, her ankle a fiery protest against the damp. The cabin was silent, save for the drip of water through the ruined roof. The man was gone. For a panicked second, she thought he'd left her, taken her mare and her supplies. She dragged herself to the door, pushing it open against the mud. He was there, standing 50 yards away, where the trail should have been. It was gone. In its place was a roaring, muddy torrent of water, 10 feet deep, churning with ripped-up trees and debris. The little creek in the canyon had become a river. The bridge, she knew, would be splinters miles downstream. He heard her and turned. He was soaked to the bone, his coat plastered to his frame. He walked back, his face grim. "It's a washout," he said, his voice flat. He didn't need to say more. "The crossing at the bottom of the pass will be gone for days, maybe a week." He pushed past her into the cabin, stripping off his sodden coat. Clara leaned against the doorframe, the reality setting in. She was trapped, not just by the storm, but with him. "We're low on wood," he said, ignoring her stare. "And this roof is leaking worse than a cheap bucket." He picked up the small, rusted axe that had been left by the hearth and went back outside. Soon, the sharp, rhythmic thunk of an axe biting into wet pine echoed through the gray morning. Clara turned back to the cabin. It was a prison, but it was shelter. She was a practical woman. Despair was a luxury she couldn't afford. She set about her own work. She took stock, her flour, now slightly damp, his coffee beans and salt, a small bag of dried pinto beans. It wasn't much. She found a dented pot, scrubbed it with grit from the floor and cold water, and set beans to soak. She used her good foot and the wall to hobble around the small space. She consolidated their bedrolls, moving them to the driest corner of the cabin. She swept the floor with a branch of pine. It was work. It was a way to keep her mind off the man outside and the men who might be hunting her. By midday, Silas, she still didn't know his name, was on the roof. She could hear him hammering, moving across the weak shingles. He'd found some old boards in the lean-to and was patching the worst of the holes. The dripping inside slowed, then mostly stopped. He came in around noon, the cold clinging to him. He moved straight to the fire, peeling off his wet shirt. Clara turned away, busying herself with the beans. But she had seen his back. It was a map of old violence. A long, pale scar ran from his left shoulder blade down to his ribs, the kind of mark a skinning knife would leave. Higher up, near his neck, was a puckered, ugly hole where a bullet had gone in, or come out. She wondered how many more there were. He stood by the fire, letting the heat lick at his skin, seemingly unaware of her gaze. He was lean, but powerfully built, all rope and muscle, designed for hard work and endurance. "The beans will be a while," she said, her voice sounding strange in the quiet room. He grunted, pulling a dry shirt from his saddlebag. He sat on his side of the room, cleaning his revolver with an oily rag. The methodical click and slide of the metal was the only sound. The day dragged on. A subtle, unspoken truce settled over them. He worked on the cabin. She worked on turning their meager supplies into food. He rechinked some of the mud between the logs. She made a crude broth and, later, baked small, dense biscuits in the skillet, setting it directly on the coals. A strange, quiet domesticity filled the small space. They moved around each other, careful not to touch, acutely aware of every breath, every movement. That night, they ate the beans and biscuits in silence. The fire had dried the cabin, and the patched roof held. It was almost comfortable. Clara found herself looking at the scar near his neck. "That one," she said, her voice low. "It looks like it nearly got you." Silas stopped, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He set it down. He stared into the fire, and his face went hard, the planes and angles tightening. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. "A bounty," he said, his voice rough. "Down in the Panhandle, man named Abel Stone killed his wife and a neighbor." He paused, and Clara waited. "I was a tracker then, not a cowboy. People paid me to find men who didn't want to be found. I was good at it." He picked up a twig, feeding it to the flames. "I found Stone at his cousin's homestead, holed up in the house. I should have waited him out, but there was a blizzard coming. I got impatient." He looked at his hands. "I went in. He was waiting. He had a boy, his own son, maybe 8 years old." His voice dropped so low Clara had to lean forward to hear it. He grabbed the boy, held him up like a shield, dared me. I fired. I thought I could. I don't know what I thought." The twig in his hand snapped. The bullet went through the boy, killed him clean. Stone. He just dropped him, gave up, laughed, said the kid wasn't his anyway. Clara closed her eyes. The nightmare she'd heard him whisper the first night. Eliza, the shot, guilt. "Eliza was my fiancée," he said, as if reading her mind. "When I got back, I told her. She said I was cursed, said the blood wouldn't wash off. She was right. I took my pay, but I couldn't spend it. I buried it with the boy." He looked up, and his eyes were hollow, the same winter sky cold she'd first seen. "I haven't hunted a man since. Been riding north for 2 years. Just riding." Clara had no words of comfort. There were none. The world was a hard place. It broke you, and you either stayed broken or you found a way to piece yourself together. "My husband," she said, the words tasting like ash. "He drank. He gambled. He owed money to a man, a powerful man. One night, he went out to settle it. They found him at the bottom of a ravine. The sheriff called it an accident." She met his gaze. "It wasn't. And now the man he owed, he wants me to pay the debt. With my land, or with me." He nodded. He understood. It was the same story, just a different kind of violence. The silence that fell between them now was different. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the ghosts they had both invited inside. The air was thick with their shared, unspoken truths. They were not good people or bad people. They were just survivors, and for the first time in months. Clara didn't feel entirely alone, but the pull she felt toward him was dangerous. It felt like leaning over the edge of that same ravine. The second day was worse. The river was still a raging, impassable monster. The waiting began to grate. Cabin fever. The space, which had seemed a shelter, now felt like a cage. They were too close. She could smell the soap and sweat and wood smoke on him. He watched her when she wasn't looking. She saw him. He watched the way she moved, the determined set of her jaw, the way she favored her ankle. She found herself watching his hands. They were scarred and capable. They had killed a child. They had also, with surprising gentleness, bandaged her ankle. The contradiction was a magnet, pulling her in. The tension was a living thing in the room, a third person. It hummed in the air, a low, vibrating wire that neither of them dared to touch. On the morning of the third day, the sun came out. The sound of the river had lessened, just slightly. It wasn't a roar anymore, just a loud, steady rush. Clara couldn't stand it another second. "I'm leaving," she announced, pushing herself up. Silas looked up from the harness he was mending. "Don't be a fool. The trail is mud. Your ankle won't hold you." "I'll ride," she said, her voice tight with a desperate, trapped anger. "I'd rather die in the mud than stay in this box another minute. You won't make it a mile. Watch me." She hobbled to the door, ignoring the white-hot pain that shot up her leg. She was furious. At the storm, at her husband, at Nolan Clay, and at this silent, broken man who watched her with those dead eyes. This man who had seen her weakness. She made it to her mare. The horse whickered, nudging her chest. Clara grabbed the saddle horn. She jammed her good foot into the stirrup and, with a choked sob of effort, tried to haul herself up. The moment her weight came down on the splinted ankle, it gave way. It wasn't a crumble, it was a snap of dry wood. The pain was blinding. She screamed, a sharp, ragged sound, and fell backward, her hands grasping at empty air. She didn't hit the mud. He was there. He moved faster than she thought possible. He caught her, his arms locking around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. They froze. She was in his arms, her face buried against the rough canvas of his coat. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. His arms were iron bands, holding her up, holding her together. He was breathing hard, the air puffing against her hair. She looked up. He was looking down at her, and his eyes were not cold. They were burning. The tension of the last 3 days, the shared confessions, the forced proximity, all of it crashed into that single, breathless moment. They were no longer two strangers. They were a man and a woman, pressed together, the scent of pine and horse and sweat between them. He said nothing. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on her mouth. Clara's heart hammered so hard she thought he must feel it. She should pull away. She should fight. This was weakness. This was surrender. He lifted her. His arms moved from her waist, one sliding under her knees, the other supporting her back. He carried her as he had the first night, but this was different. This was not a rescue. It was a claiming. He carried her back inside the cabin and set her down on her bedroll, his movements slow and deliberate. He knelt in front of her. Neither of them spoke. The silence was deafening, charged with everything that was about to happen. He retreated to his side of the room, and the tension was back. But it was worse. It was a wire stretched to the breaking point. Night fell. The argument started out of nothing. It started because the silence was too loud. "You like this?" Clara spat, her voice trembling with rage and shame. She was furious at her ankle, at her helplessness. "You like having me trapped here, weak, owing you." Silas looked up from the fire. "I don't like any of this." "You're just like him," she pushed, wanting to wound him, wanting to drive him away before he got any closer. "Just like all of them, thinking you own me just because you helped me." That hit him. His face darkened. "I'm not him," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'm not the man who hurt you." He stood up, towering over her. "And I'm not the man who killed that boy. I'm just—" "You're what?" she taunted, looking up at him, unafraid. "You're a coward. That's what you are. Hiding up here in the mountains because you can't face what you did. You're no better than I am. We're both just running." His control snapped. He lunged forward, grabbing her by the upper arms, hauling her to her knees. "Don't you say that," he snarled, his face inches from hers. It was the wrong thing to do. Clara reacted from pure, blind instinct. She brought her hand up and slapped him, hard, across the face. The sound was like a gunshot in the tiny cabin. His head snapped back. A red mark bloomed instantly on his cheek. He didn't let go. His eyes, fixed on hers, were now blazing with a dark, raw fire. His grip on her arms tightened, his fingers bruising her. He grabbed her wrist, the one that had struck him, and his other hand went to her jaw, forcing her to look at him. They were breathing the same air, balanced on the knife edge of violence and something else, something terrifyingly new. "You," he started to say. She cut him off. "Just do it," she whispered, her voice broken. "Just stop this." The fire in them, The guilt, the loneliness, the desperate, aching need of two broken souls. It all erupted. He crashed his mouth down on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate, messy, and raw. It was the anger of the argument and the pain of their pasts. It was all the things they couldn't say, expressed in the brutal, sudden language of touch. His beard was rough against her skin, and his grip was bruising, but she didn't pull away. She kissed him back with the same ferocity, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. It was a drowning, and he was the only other person in the water. He tore his mouth from hers, and for a second, they just stared at each other, panting, their chests heaving. The slap, the anger, it was all gone, burned away by this sudden, undeniable heat. He lifted her, not to his bedroll, but to hers. He came down with her, their limbs tangling. The firelight flickered over them, casting shadows that danced with their own. He tore at the buttons of her shirt, and she fumbled with the clasp of his denims. It was slow, and it was raw. It was not love. It was something more primal. It was about feeling something other than pain. It was about being touched by someone who understood the scars, inside and out. They moved together in the flickering light, a tangle of desperate limbs and shared pain. It was an affirmation that they were still alive, even if they were both shattered. They clung to each other in the small, dark cabin, and for a few hours, the ghosts and the storm outside faded to a dull, distant roar. Morning came, cold and unforgiving. Clara woke first, tangled in his arms, his heavier body a warm weight against her back. The first thing she felt was a wave of shame so profound it made her nauseous. She had been weak. She had let her loneliness, her fear, her need, break down the walls she had so carefully built. She was no better than a whore, trading her body for a moment of comfort. She slipped from his grasp, pulling her torn shirt around her, her movements stiff. She hobbled to the far side of the room, wrapping her own blanket tightly around her shoulders, her back to him. Silas woke a few moments later. He saw her immediately. He saw the rigid set of her shoulders. He saw her shame and his own guilt, never far from the surface, rushed in to fill the void. He had done this. He had taken advantage of her weakness, of their confinement. He had ruined the one thing that had felt clean in years, her trust. He had proven Eliza right. He was cursed. He stood, pulling on his denims, his face closing up, becoming the cold, distant mask he'd worn the first night. He had ruined it. "Coffee's on," he grunted, his voice rough. He grabbed his coat and his rifle and stalked out of the cabin, leaving her alone in the cold morning light. Clara put her head in her hands, her whole body trembling. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in months. But she felt the hollowness inside her, a new, aching void. She was splashing cold water on her face when she heard him. "Get inside," he said. Not a request, an order. His voice was sharp, urgent. She moved to the doorway. He was standing by the lean-to, his rifle already at his shoulder, aimed not at the flooded river, but up at the ridge line. "What is it?" "Hoofbeats. One rider, moving slow." Clara squinted, her hand shielding her eyes from the new sun. Up on the ridge, maybe 200 yards distant, a man on a tall gray horse sat motionless, outlined against the sky. He was just watching the cabin. He wore a long, dark duster and a flat-brimmed hat. He stayed there for a full minute, a silent, patient sentinel. Then, as if satisfied, he turned his horse, not in a hurry, and vanished back into the pine trees. Silas lowered his rifle, but he didn't relax. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a sick, cold dread replacing the shame. She knew that hat. She knew the way the man sat his horse. "I know him," she whispered, her voice shaking so hard she could barely speak. "His name is Finch. He's the tracker Nolan Clay uses. He found me." The silence left by the departed rider was heavier and colder than the morning air. The shame of the night before, the raw awkwardness that had driven Silas from the cabin, was instantly burned away by a clean, sharp terror. Silas came back inside, his rifle held low. He didn't look at her, not at first. He went to the small, grimy window, peering out at the ridge, his body tense. "He's gone," he said. "Who was he?" Clara sank onto the edge of the cot. Her voice was flat, all the life drained from it. "His name is Finch. He's a tracker. He works for Nolan Clay." Silas turned from the window. The question was in his eyes, hard and demanding. "I told you my husband had debts," Clara said, her gaze fixed on the dirt floor. "I didn't tell you the whole of it." She laid it bare. The words came out in a quiet, steady rush, as if saying them fast would make them hurt less. She told him about Arthur's final gamble, the $500 debt he'd run up playing cards with Clay, a sum he could never hope to pay. She told him about Arthur's accident just 2 days later. "Nolan Clay came to my homestead," she whispered, her hands nodding in her lap. "He offered to forgive the debt in exchange for the deed to my land. It's good land, well-watered. He's been trying to get it for years." Silas watched her, his face a mask. "I refused," she continued. "It was all I had left of my own, all I had that Arthur hadn't ruined." She finally looked up, her eyes bright with a feverish, unshed grief. "That's when he made his other offer. He said the debt could be worked off. He said a woman alone has a hard time, and he was prepared to be generous, if I was prepared to be accommodating." The air in the cabin turned to ice. Silas understood. Clay didn't just want her land. He wanted her. She was the prize, the final piece of collateral. "I left that night. I've been running ever since. He must have hired Finch to track me, and now he knows where I am, or where I was." Silas turned away from her, running a hand through his hair. He paced the small room. 3 steps one way, 3 steps back. He was a wolf in a trap. This was not his fight. This was exactly the kind of trouble he had ridden north to escape. Blood. Other people's messes. A woman. It was a no-win hand. "He'll have men," Silas said, his voice distant. "A man like that doesn't just have a tracker. He has riders, men who'll do what he wants for coin." He stopped pacing and looked at her. His face was set in the cold. Distant lines she remembered from the first night. "This ain't my fight, ma'am. I've done my part. I got you through the storm. But this is a war. And I'm no soldier." Clara stood up, her bad ankle taking her weight. She didn't flinch. The pain was nothing. "I know," she said, her voice shaking but hard. "I saw you last night." "You're not a hero, Silas. You're a man running from a ghost, just like I am." She hobbled a step closer to him. The air between them crackled. The memory of their bodies tangled in the blankets was there, sharp and undeniable. "I am not asking you to be a hero," she said, her voice dropping. "I'm not asking you to fight my war. I'm asking you to ride with me. To the next town. Just a town. I can't make it alone. Not with this ankle. And not with them out there. After that, you can go wherever you're headed. I won't stop you." He looked at her for a long time. He saw her pride, her terror, and her grit. He saw a woman as broken as he was, just in different places. He owed her something. Maybe not for the night they'd shared, but for the truths they'd traded. "The river's down," he said, his voice rough. He nodded toward the door. "But it'll still be a hard crossing. We should have left an hour ago." He turned, grabbing his saddlebags. He didn't say yes. But he didn't say no. They rode out into a world washed clean and broken. The sun was bright, but the air was cold. The trail was a slick, dangerous river of mud. The river at the pass was no longer a torrent, but it was still a wide, angry, brown snake. Silas took the lead. "Keep your mare's head up," he yelled over the roar. "Don't fight her. Let her find her feet." He plunged his roan into the churning water. The horse stumbled, recovered, and began to swim. Clara followed, her heart in her throat. The icy water soaked her to the waist instantly, stealing her breath. Her mare panicked for a second, but the pull of Silas's horse on the other side gave it courage. They made it across, scrambling up the muddy, collapsing bank. soaked and shivering. They didn't stop. Silas pushed them hard, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges, reading the land. He was a tracker. He'd said he was hunting for the hunters. They rode in silence for hours. The only sound the squelch of hooves in the mud and the wind in the pines. The tension was a cold knot in Clara's stomach. Every shadow looked like a man. Every snap of a twig sounded like a rifle being cocked. The ambush came in the late afternoon, in a narrow canyon where the trail wound through a stand of thick aspen. They were almost through it when a voice rang out. "That's far enough. Mrs. Miller, the Baron just wants to talk. Finch." He stepped out from the trees, not 20 yards ahead. His duster pulled back to show the gun on his hip. Another man, heavier, with a shotgun, stepped out behind them, blocking the trail. Clara's mare shied, dancing nervously. "This ain't your concern, Cowboy," Finch said, his eyes cold and assessing. He ignored Clara, speaking only to Silas. "You ride on. The woman stays. That's the only way you see another sunrise." Silas didn't move. His hands were resting on his saddle horn. His body relaxed. He looked bored. "She with me," he said, his voice quiet, but it carried in the cold air. "Last chance," Finch snarled, his hand moving toward his gun. The man behind them raised his shotgun. "Don't be a fool, friend. She ain't worth it." Clara watched, her blood frozen. It happened faster than she could track. Silas didn't draw. He had his rifle. It was in the scabbard, under his right leg, in one fluid, impossible motion. He leaned, pulled the Winchester free, levered around, and fired. Not at Finch, at the man behind them. The rifle's explosion echoed in the narrow canyon. The man with the shotgun looked surprised. A dark, wet stain appeared on his chest. He staggered, fired the shotgun into the dirt, and collapsed. Finch was fast, but Silas was faster. Before the tracker could even clear his holster, Silas had worked the lever and the rifle was on him. "Drop it," Silas ordered. His voice was no longer quiet. It was iron. It was the voice of a man who had given orders like this before, and had been obeyed, or had buried the man who didn't. Finch's hand froze. He looked at Silas, at the dead calm certainty in his eyes. He looked at his partner, bleeding out in the mud. He slowly raised his hands. "You just made a mistake, Cowboy." Finch spat, his face pale with rage. "Nolan Clay owns this territory. He'll see you hang for this." "Maybe," Silas said. He nudged his horse forward. "But not today. Leave the gun. And the horse. Start walking." Finch stared, his mind working. But the rifle was steady. He unbuckled his gun belt, let it fall. He swung down from his horse. "Go," Silas said. Finch gave Clara a look of pure, concentrated hatred. Then he turned and began the long walk back, disappearing into the trees. Silas didn't move until he was gone. He sat his horse, the rifle resting on his thigh, the smoke from the single shot drifting away. He was breathing calmly. He hadn't even broken a sweat. He looked at the dead man, his face grim. "Self-defense," he said, to himself more than to her. But his voice was hollow. He had killed again. The ghost he was running from had just gained a companion. Clara was shaking so hard she could barely hold the reins. She was terrified, and she was alive. She looked at Silas, at this stranger who had just killed a man to save her. She owed him her life. The thought was a heavier weight than any debt. They rode into the town of Medicine Creek an hour after dark. It was larger than the last place, with a 2-story hotel and 3 saloons. They were muddy, exhausted, and haunted. Silas dismounted, his movements stiff. He helped Clara down, his hands firm on her waist. She leaned on him, her ankle throbbing, her entire body weak with delayed shock. He pushed open the door to the hotel. A clerk in a clean shirt looked up from his ledger. His eyes took in their state. The mud, the exhaustion, the way Silas's hand rested on the revolver on his hip. "We need a room," Silas said. His voice was flat. The clerk's eyes flickered to Clara, leaning on Silas, her hair damp and wild. He pursed his lips. "We don't rent to. My wife is injured." Silas cut him off. his voice dropping to that iron-cold tone. "She needs a bed. Now." The clerk's attitude changed. He saw the way Silas looked at him. "Yes, sir, of course, Mr. Smith," Silas said. "Mr. and Mrs. Smith, one night." He paid in coin. The clerk handed him a key. "Room 3, top of the stairs." The room was small, but clean. It had a brass bedstead, a wash basin, and a pitcher of water. It felt like a palace. Silas kicked the door shut, and the lock clicked into place. A sound of final, temporary safety. Clara sank onto the bed, the mattress groaning. The pretense of the hallway evaporated, leaving a raw, charged silence. They were here, together, in a room with one bed, bound by violence and the lie he'd told downstairs. Silas poured water into the basin. He handed her a cloth. "Wash up," he said. He kept his back to her, checking the window, ensuring the curtains were drawn tight. She washed the mud and grime from her face and hands. The cold water felt good. When she was done, he took the cloth and did the same. They moved around each other in the small space, the air thick with unspoken things. The ambush, the lie, the night in the cabin. He checked his revolver, reloading the one spent chamber from the fight, and set it on the nightstand, next to the bed. He unbuckled his gun belt and hung it on the bedpost. He turned to her. "You take the bed. Your ankle needs rest. I'll take the floor." He grabbed the thin blanket from the foot of the bed and spread it by the door. A sentinel. Clara watched him. He had saved her. He had killed for her. And now he was shutting her out again, retreating behind his wall of guilt. The awkwardness of the morning in the cabin felt like a lifetime ago. They had passed through fire since then. She lay back on the bed, her clothes still damp, her ankle a dull fire. She was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. She listened to him breathing in the dark, a deep, steady sound. But she knew he wasn't asleep. She could not let it be. She couldn't let him retreat into that cold, lonely place. Not after today. She sat up. Her heart was pounding. A slow, heavy drum. This was not desperation. This was not loneliness. This was a choice. "Silas," she whispered into the dark. His breathing hitched. He was silent. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her bare feet touched the cold floorboards. She stood, biting her lip against the pain in her ankle, and hobbled the few steps to where he lay. He was watching her, a dark shape against the floor, his eyes glinting in the sliver of moonlight from the window. She didn't say anything. She knelt beside him, her knees cracking. She reached out and touched his face. His beard was rough. His skin was warm. He didn't move, but she felt him trembling. She lay down on the hard floor beside him, on the thin blanket, pulling her own quilt from the bed to cover them both. She pressed her body against his, slotting herself against his side. He was rigid, a man braced for a blow. She put her hand on his chest, flat against his heart. She could feel it hammering. "It's all right," she whispered. "I'm here." She kissed his shoulder. It was a slow, tender act. It was not the raw, hungry crash in the cabin. This was a quiet offering. It was vulnerability. It was a thanks. It was a plea. He shuddered. And then, slowly, as if his body were resisting, his arms came around her. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. He held her as if she were the only thing keeping him from falling apart. They made love on the floor of the hotel room. In the dark, with the sounds of the town filtering up from the street. It was slow. It was aching. It was a desperate, tender search for solace. It was two scarred, broken people trying to feel whole, trying to find a patch of solid ground in a world that was washing away beneath their feet. It was a quiet, reverent act in the face of death. Afterward, they lay tangled, the blanket pulled over them, the silence peaceful. His walls were down. She could feel it. "I wanted to die," he whispered, his voice thick. Clara waited, her hand resting on his chest, her fingers tracing the old scar she'd seen. "After Eliza left, after the boy," he took a shaky breath. "I sat in a hotel room, just like this, in Amarillo. I had my pistol. I put it in my mouth. I wanted to pull the trigger. I wanted it to be over." He swallowed. "I don't know why I didn't. I just couldn't. Maybe I thought I deserved to live with it. That dying was too easy." He turned, shifting to look at her in the dim light. "You called me a coward. In the cabin. You were right. I've been running ever since." "What happened, Silas?" she asked, her voice soft. "What you told me. It wasn't the whole story. I heard it in your voice." He was silent for a long time. She felt the confession building in him. "It wasn't a stray bullet," he said, his voice cracking. "It was collateral. That's what they call it. Stone. He held the boy up. I had a clear shot, at Stone's head, right over the boy's shoulder. I knew I could make it, but I was angry, impatient. I wanted him. And just as I pulled the trigger, Stone flinched. He moved. And the boy, he stepped right into the path." He closed his eyes. "I took the shot. I knew it was a risk. I took it anyway. I killed that child just as sure as if I'd aimed for him." He let out a long, ragged breath. He had finally said it, the worst of it. Clara listened. She felt the self-loathing radiating from him, the poison he'd been carrying for 2 years. She did not offer him forgiveness. She did not tell him it wasn't his fault. It was, they both knew it. Instead, she rose up on one elbow. She looked down at his face, at the pain etched there. She leaned down and kissed him. A slow, deep kiss that held no judgment. It held no absolution. It just held acceptance. It said, "I see all of you, and I'm still here." He clung to her, a man finding his first breath after nearly drowning. Morning came too soon. They woke in the gray light, still on the floor, their limbs entangled. The mood was heavy, but changed. A bond had been forged, tempered in violence and confession. Silas stood, his back aching. He dressed quietly, his movements economical. Clara watched him from the bed, which she'd returned to before dawn. He was her partner. She realized, in what she didn't know, but they were tied. He strapped on his gun belt. He walked to the door, his hand on his revolver. A habit. He was going to check the hall. He opened the door a crack, peering out. Then he froze. "What is it?" Clara asked. Sitting up, he opened the door wider. There, driven deep into the wood of the doorframe, was a large skinning knife. Pinned by its blade was a folded piece of paper. Silas ripped the paper free, his face hardening. He unfolded it. The words were scrawled in charcoal. "We want her. Step aside. Cowboy." A cold dread washed through the room. Finch had made it to a telegraph office, or Clay had other men here already. Silas crumpled the paper in his fist. His face, which had been so open just hours before, was now a mask of cold stone. The curse was back. "We run," he said, his voice flat. "We pack and we run. We head north, into the territories. They won't follow us into Sioux land." He began gathering his few things, shoving them into his saddlebag. Clara watched him. She looked at the knife pinning the note. She looked at Silas, his back to her, already planning his escape. And something inside her, something that had been breaking and bending for years, finally snapped. It didn't break. It hardened into steel. "No," she said. Silas stopped, his back still to her. "What did you say?" "No." She stood up from the bed, ignoring her ankle. "I'm done hiding. I've been running from Arthur's shame, from Clay, from men like Finch, my whole life. I won't run anymore." He turned to face her. His eyes were wild. "You don't understand. This isn't a fight. It's an execution. He'll send 10 men, 20. He owns this land. He'll kill us both and buy the sheriff a drink after." "Then let him try," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I'm going back, to my homestead. It's mine. He can't have it." "It's just land," Silas shouted, taking a step toward her. "It's just dirt. It's not worth dying for." "It is to me," she shouted back, her own anger rising. "It's the only thing that is. What about you, Silas? What are you going to do? Just keep riding? Keep running from that boy's ghost until you're too old to sit a horse? Is that your plan?" "This is not my fight," he roared, his hands balled into fists. "I told you, I'm not a hero. I'm not dying for your dirt." The words hit her like a slap. All the tenderness of the night, all the shared pain, evaporated. He was still that man, the man who ran. "You're right," she said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. "You're not a hero. You're a coward." The word hung in the small room, vibrating with betrayal. Silas's face went white, as if she had physically struck him. He stared at her, his expression shattering, 1,000 emotions passing through his eyes. Hurt, rage, shame, and a deep, profound sorrow. He looked at her as if she were a stranger, as if she had just undone all the frail trust they had built. He didn't say another word. He grabbed his rifle from the corner. He grabbed his hat from the bedpost. "Silas," she started, instantly regretting the word, the poison of it. He didn't look back. He walked to the door, pulled it open, and stepped out into the hall. He didn't slam it. He just closed it quietly behind him. Clara stood in the middle of the room, alone. The note crumpled on the floor. His boot steps faded down the stairs. He was gone. The word hung in the air of the small hotel room, sharp and poisoned. Coward. Clara stood, trembling, watching the door swing shut. The quiet click of the latch was louder than a gunshot. He was gone. The silence he left behind was total, a vacuum that sucked all the air from her lungs. She sank onto the bed, the fight draining out of her, leaving only a cold, hollow ache. She had done it. She had driven away the only person in 2 years who had looked at her and seen something other than a piece of property or a victim. She had used his deepest wound as a weapon, and it had worked. She was, finally, completely alone. She sat there for an hour, or maybe it was just a minute. Time had lost its shape. The warning pinned to the door was a promise. They would come for her. Running was not an option. Not anymore. Not with a bad ankle, no money, and nowhere to go. Her homestead. The word was a prayer. It was the only solid thing left. She stood up. Her ankles screamed, but she ignored it. She packed her few things back into her saddlebag. She took the crumpled note from the floor and tucked it into her pocket. A reminder. She checked her revolver, her father's old Navy Colt. It was loaded. She had 6 shots. She limped down the stairs, her hand on the rail. The hotel lobby was empty. The clerk was gone, probably counting Clay's silver. She slipped out the front door into the bright, cold morning. The town was alive, wagons moving, people walking the boardwalks. They all looked at her. Or maybe it just felt that way. Every face was a potential enemy. Her first priority was her mare. She moved along the street, trying to look purposeful, trying not to limp. She kept to the shadows, moving toward the livery at the end of the street. The stable was quiet, smelling of hay and manure. Her mare whickered from a stall in the back. Relief washed over her. At least they hadn't taken her horse. She paid the hostler, a young boy who looked at her with nervous eyes. He had probably heard the gossip. She saddled the mare herself, her movements stiff and sore. She was just tightening the cinch when 2 men stepped out of the shadows of the tack room. They were not Finch. These men were different, thicker, uglier. They wore trail dust and cheap whiskey like a uniform. "Well now, look at this," the first one said. He had a scarred lip and yellow teeth. "Mrs. Miller, I presume. The Baron is very eager to see you." "So, he said to bring her in one piece." The second man grunted. He was large, a wall of muscle and dirt. But he didn't say she had to be pretty. Clara's hand moved toward her revolver. Before her fingers touched the grip, the big one lunged. He grabbed her wrist in a grip that felt like a blacksmith's vice. He twisted. Clara cried out as the gun was ripped from her hand. It clattered on the packed earth floor. The first man laughed. "Not so tough without your cowboy. Are you? Shut her up and let's go," the big one said. He clamped a filthy hand over her mouth, muffling her scream. Clara fought. She kicked, she bit, she twisted, but it was useless. They were too strong. They began to drag her, not toward the street, but toward the back of the stable, toward the narrow, dark alley that ran between the livery and the feed store. It was a place for trash and rats, a place where no one would see. She was losing. Her ankle gave way, and she went down, the men dragging her through the mud and straw. The one with the scarred lip pulled a length of rope from his belt. "She's a fighter. Hold her still." The big man pinned her, his knee in her back. She could barely breathe. Panic, cold and absolute, flooded her system. This was it. This was how it ended. A shadow fell over the alley entrance. "Get your hands off her!" Silas. He was standing there, his long coat pushed back, his hands empty at his sides. He looked calm. He looked as if he were ordering a drink. The man with the scarred lip turned, his hand dropping to his gun. "Well, look who it is, the cowboy. Thought you'd be halfway to Canada by now. You made a mistake coming back." "I made a mistake leaving," Silas said, his voice flat. He took a step into the alley. He hadn't left. He couldn't. He had made it to the edge of town. The roan, fighting the bit, eager to run. Her voice had echoed in his head. Coward. It was the same as cursed. It was the truth. He had run from the panhandle. He had run from Eliza. He had tried to run from himself. And in that hotel room, he had run from her. He was done running. He turned the horse around, not knowing what he would do, just knowing he couldn't leave her to face this alone. The scar-lipped man drew. He was fast. Silas was faster. He didn't go for his own gun. He moved, closing the distance in 2 long strides. He caught the man's gun hand, not to stop it, but to turn it. He drove the man's arm upward, smashing the wrist against the brick wall of the feed store. Bone snapped. The man screamed, his pistol firing uselessly into the sky. Silas hit him once, a hard, measured blow to the jaw that snapped his head back. The man crumpled. The big man had let go of Clara to face this new threat. He roared, pulling a massive Bowie knife from his belt. He lunged at Silas. Clara was free. She scrambled, gasping for air. She saw the man she'd stabbed in the canyon, saw Silas's rifle, saw the blood. She saw the man with the knife bearing down on Silas. She pulled the small skinning knife she'd carried in her boots since she was 16. As the big man raised his arm to plunge the Bowie knife into Silas's back, Clara launched herself forward. She drove her small blade up and in, under his ribs, with all her strength. His roar turned into a wet, surprised grunt. He stopped, his arm frozen in the air. He looked down at the handle protruding from his side, his eyes wide with disbelief. He turned, slowly, to look at her. The first man, the one with the broken wrist, was on his knees. He was fumbling for his dropped pistol with his left hand. He got it. He raised it, his face a mask of pain and hate. Silas saw him. He shoved Clara aside and dove for the man, just as the gun went off. The explosion was deafening. Silas felt a white-hot fire tear across his chest. It felt like being kicked by a mule. He grunted, falling, but his momentum carried him forward. He crashed into the gunman, his head smashing into the man's face. Both of them went down in a heap. The alley was silent, save for the sound of the big man, gurgling, as he slid down the wall. Clara stared at the blood on her hands, her knife, the man she had stabbed. Then she saw Silas, unmoving, on top of the other man. "Silas!" she screamed. He pushed himself up, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I'm all right," he panted. "It grazed me." A dark stain was already spreading across the side of his shirt, just below his ribs. Shouts were coming from the street. "Gunshot! In the alley!" Silas grabbed her arm, hauling her to her feet. "Now we run! For real this time!" He snatched his revolver from the holster of the unconscious man, shoved it in his belt, and grabbed Clara's from the dirt. He pushed it into her hand. "To the horses! Move!" They burst from the alley. The hostler boy was staring, his face white. Silas threw a silver dollar at his feet. "For the trouble!" He boosted Clara onto her mare, his face tight with pain. He swung up onto his roan, hissing as the movement pulled at his wound. "Which way?" Clara yelled. "North!" he shouted. "Into the hills! Ride!" They kicked the horses, charging out of the livery, scattering chickens and pedestrians. A man in the street yelled, pulling a pistol, but they were already past him. They thundered down the main street and out of town, leaving the shouts and the dead and the dying behind them. They didn't stop for an hour. They rode hard, pushing the horses up into the rocky, pine-choked high country, following a narrow deer trail. Silas led. His body slumped over the saddle horn, but he never slowed. Clara followed, her heart pounding. The image of the knife, the blood, burned into her mind. She had killed a man, or near to it. She felt sick, and she felt, strangely, alive. The sun was high and hot when Silas finally pulled his roan to a halt. He was swaying, his face the color of wet ash. "We need to stop," he gasped. "I'm bleeding. A lot." He slid from the saddle, his legs buckling. He caught himself against the horse, breathing hard. "Where?" Clara asked. Sliding down, her own ankle forgotten. "Where can we go?" Silas pointed up the ridge. "There. An old mission. Burned. No one goes there." It took them another 20 minutes to reach it. Clara leading both horses. Silas holding onto his saddle, stumbling. The church was a skeleton. The stone walls stood, scorched black, open to the sky. The roof was gone. Just a few charred beams angled against the blue. The bell tower had collapsed, a pile of rock and melted brass. It was a place of ghosts, but it was hidden. Clara led the horses into the relative cover of the nave, the main part of the church, where the floor was still stone, and tethered them. Silas collapsed against the remains of the altar, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. "Let me see," Clara said, her voice gentle. She knelt beside him. His shirt was soaked, the blood a dark, crusted map. She took her knife, the one she had just used, and wiped it clean on her denims. Her hand was steady. She cut the shirt away. The bullet had torn a nasty, 10-inch groove across his ribs. It was deep, oozing blood, but it looked as if it had missed anything vital. It was a graze, just as he'd said, but a terrible one. "It's clean through," she said, her voice more confident than she felt. "But it's deep. We need to wash it." She took her canteen and poured the water over the wound. Silas hissed, his whole body going rigid, but he didn't cry out. She tore a long, clean strip from her petticoat. "I have whiskey," he muttered, his eyes still closed. He fumbled at his saddlebag. She found the flask. "This is going to hurt. Not as much as leavin'," he whispered. She poured the whiskey into the raw flesh. He arched off the ground, a strangled sound torn from his throat, his hands balling into fists, but he held still. Clara worked quickly, washing it clean, her touch firm but gentle. She packed the wound with the cloth and then wrapped another strip tightly around his ribs, creating a pressure bandage. He slumped back, sweating, his eyes opening. He looked at her. "You came back for me," he'd said in the alley. Now she understood. "You came back for me," she whispered. He just nodded. They sat in silence for a long time. The wind whistled through the ruined arches of the windows. They were two scarred people in a scarred, holy place. She had stabbed a man. He had taken a bullet for her. The lines between them were gone. As the afternoon light softened, they built a small, smokeless fire of dry twigs in the old stone font. The air grew cold. Clara sat close to Silas, sharing a blanket. He was weak, but his color was returning. He stared into the tiny flame, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. "She called me cursed," he said, his voice quiet. Clara turned to look at him. "Eliza, my fiancée." He didn't look up. "I told you she left. I didn't tell you how. When I came back from Amarillo, I told her about the boy. I told her it was my fault. I was looking for, I don't know, forgiveness. Maybe." He picked up a small stone, weighing it in his hand. "She just looked at me. Her eyes were so cold, colder than that storm. She said I had the devil's mark on me. She said I had blood on my hands, and it would never wash out. She packed her trunk. The last thing she said to me, she said, 'You are cursed, Silas, and you will curse everything and everyone you touch.' He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it ached to see. And she was right. I rode away. And I've been running ever since. And the first people I stopped for, you. I bring this blood, death. I almost got you killed. Twice. Clara listened. She heard the truth of his pain, the guilt he had carried like a cross for 2 years. She understood, in that moment, why he had run. She reached out, her fingers tracing the edge of the new bandage on his chest. She could feel the heat of his skin, the steady, slow beat of his heart, his life. Maybe she was right, Clara said, her voice a low murmur. He flinches, turning his face to her, a flicker of betrayal in his eyes. And maybe I am too, she continued, her gaze unwavering. My husband cursed me with his debts. Nolan Clay curses me with his greed. That man in the alley, I put a knife in him. Silas, I felt it go in. She looked at her own hands, still stained. Maybe we are both cursed. He stared at her, at the quiet acceptance in her face. She was not judging him. She was joining him. The tension in the air changed. It was no longer the heat of desperation or the comfort of solace. It was something slower, heavier. It was recognition. He reached up, his hand covering hers where it rested on his chest. His skin was rough against hers. He tugged gently. She leaned in. He kissed her. It was not the desperate crash in the cabin. It was not the tender solace in the hotel. It was slow. It was reverent. It was a kiss that acknowledged every scar, every ghost, every drop of blood they had shed. It was a kiss that said, I see your curse, and I am not afraid. He pulled her closer, hissing as his ribs protested. But he didn't stop. He lay back against the stone wall, pulling her with him, onto the bed of their shared blankets, under the broken, charred rafters, with the vast, Wyoming stars shining down like 1,000 cold eyes. They made love. It was a slow, deliberate claiming. It was an acceptance of the broken, battered bodies they inhabited. It was a defiant act of life in a house of ruin. Afterward, they lay tangled, the chill of the night air kept at bay by the blankets and their own shared warmth. Clara lay with her head on his good shoulder, listening to his breathing, steady and deep. Maybe we are both cursed, Silas, she whispered into the darkness, her lips brushing his skin. Or maybe we're just all that's left. He held her tighter. For the first time, his ghost was quiet. A sound woke them, the scrape of a boot on stone. Silas was moving before he was fully awake, his rifle in his hands, pulling Clara behind him. A man stood in the ruined archway, silhouetted against the pale gray dawn. He was old, dressed in the black, worn robes of a priest. His hands held up. Peace, my children, the man said. His voice was old and raspy. I saw the tracks. I feared. Well, I see I was right to fear. Who are you? Silas asked, his rifle still level. I am Father Miguel, the priest said. He stepped into the light. His face was a web of deep lines, his eyes sad. I am all that is left of this place. I tend to the people in Medicine Creek. He looked at Clara, at her bruised face. He looked at Silas, at the bloody bandage around his chest. You are the ones from the alley. It wasn't a question. We defended ourselves, Clara said, her voice strong. I know. The priest nodded. The man you stabbed, he will live. The other is dead. But that is not why I am here. I came to warn you. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. I was in the sheriff's office this morning, before sunrise. I was fetching him for a last rites. That man, Finch, was there, and the hotel clerk. They were talking to Sheriff Brody. Money was passed. Silas, a great deal of it. Nolan Clay's pockets are deeper than the canyon. The priest looked at Silas. Brody is registering a warrant for your arrest, for the murder of the man in the canyon, and the man in the alley. He's calling you a hired gun. He turned his sad eyes to Clara. And for you, my child, a warrant for theft and accomplice to murder. They say you are his whore. Clara flinched, but her eyes stayed hard. You cannot stay here, the priest said. "You cannot go to any town in this territory. Clay owns the law now. He has bought it." He offered them a small leather pouch. "It is not much. Dried jerky and a prayer. God be with you. Clay is a serpent in this valley." They thanked him. He gave them a blessing and disappeared as quietly as he had come. They saddled the horses in silence. The news was a cold weight. There was no law. There was no running. There was only Clay. "My homestead?" Clara said, her voice devoid of emotion. "It's northeast of here, a half-day's ride." Silas looked at her. "Clara, he knows where it is. He'll have men there." "I don't care," she said. "It's mine. It's the only asset I have. I have to see it." Silas saw the look in her eyes. It was the same look he'd seen when she'd refused to run. Not stubbornness, just a deep, unshakable core of iron. He nodded. He would not leave her. They rode. Silas was sore, his ribs a constant, dull fire. But he sat tall. The fight had cost him, but it had also given him something back, his purpose. They smelled it before they saw it. The wind carried the scent on it, the bitter, acrid tang of wet ash and scorched pine. They topped the last rise. Clara pulled her mare to a stop. She just stared. The small cabin her father had built with his own hands was gone. It was a smoking, blackened square on the ground. The barn had collapsed into a pile of charred timbers. The fences were scorched posts. The wire curled and melted. Even the big cottonwood tree by the creek, the one she'd played under as a child, was a black, leafless skeleton. It was all gone, everything. Clay's message was final. It was never about the debt. It was never about the land. It was about her. She had defied him, and he had erased her. Clara sat on her mare, motionless. The smoke, a thin, gray plume, was the only thing moving. Everything else was still dead. The wind whispered through the charred branches of the cottonwood, a sound like a dry sob. She had run for 2 months, suffered the storm, the fear, the shame, all to protect this pile of ash, this patch of scorched dirt. She made a sound, a low, animal noise that started deep in her chest. It was the sound of the last rope snapping. She slid from the saddle, her legs giving way. She didn't fall. She crumpled. She knelt in the black, wet ash of what had been her front porch, the home her father had built. She touched the charred wood. It was still warm. She had held herself together through Arthur's death, through the humiliation of Clay's offer, through the flight, the storm, the collision, the fight in the alley. She had not cried. She had not broken. Now, she did. It started as a low, ragged keen, the sound of a wounded animal. Then it tore loose, a scream of such pure, undiluted anguish and rage that the horses shied, pulling at their reins. She screamed at the black sky, at the dead land, at Nolan Clay. Then the screams dissolved into sobs, great, tearing gasps that ripped through her body, shaking her to the bone. She pounded the wet earth with her fists, smearing her face with soot and tears. Everything was gone. Her past, her anchor, her name. It had all been erased by fire. Silas dismounted slowly, his ribs a sharp, hot protest. He stood a few feet away, his shadow falling over her. He didn't speak. He didn't offer comfort or platitudes. There were no words for this. He just waited, his presence a solid, unmoving thing in her whirlwind of grief. When her sobs finally quieted, when she was just a shivering, huddled shape on the ground, he moved. He knelt beside her. Not in the ash, but close. He put his hand on her back, a heavy, warm weight. She flinched. Then, instead of pulling away, she collapsed against him. She turned and buried her face in his coat, his shirt, against the solid warmth of his body. She wrapped her arms around his waist, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing left on earth. She cried into his chest, a broken, desperate flood of grief. Silas held her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, his hand stroking her hair. He held her as she shook. He held her as the last of her old life turned to smoke and ash. He didn't say, "It will be all right." He knew it wouldn't. He just held on, absorbing her pain, his own ghost silent for once, pushed back by the raw, immediate agony of hers. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling in the ruins of her life. The sun began to dip, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of blood red and violet. Finally, her shiver subsided. She was empty. She pulled back, wiping her face with her sleeve, leaving a long streak of soot. She looked at the ruin, her eyes hollow. "Dead. He wins," she whispered. "I have nothing left. He wins." Silas looked at her. He saw the emptiness in her eyes. He saw the ghost he knew so well, the specter of surrender, and it made him angry. He gripped her shoulders, his fingers firm. "No," he said, his voice a low, rough growl. "He wins if we let him. He wins if we run." Clara looked at him, uncomprehending. "Run? There's nowhere to go. Silas, the law is bought. This," she gestured to the smoking ruin, "is what's left. This is the end." "No," he said again, his voice harder. "This is not the end. This is a reckoning." He stood, pulling her to her feet. "He thinks he's beaten you. He thinks he can burn a woman's home and face no consequence. He's wrong." Clara stared at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm done running," Silas said, his eyes burning with a new, cold fire. The ghost of the boy was still there, but it was standing behind him now, not in front of him. "This man, Clay, he's a cancer. He thinks he's a baron, but he's just a bully and a thief. And a murderer." He made her a vow, there in the smoking ruins of her life. "I can't get your home back. I can't bring back your husband, but I can help you get justice, if you want it. But it means we stop running. It means we go to him. We go to his fortress, and we burn him down." A spark returned to Clara's eyes, a tiny, dangerous ember in the gray ash. "Justice," she said, tasting the word. It was foreign. "You mean, kill him?" "No," Silas said. "Killing him is just revenge. He dies, and another man just like him takes his place. I mean justice. I mean ripping his power out by the roots. The priest said he bought the law. We need to find something he can't buy his way out of. How?" "A man like Clay," Silas said, his mind working, the old tracker's instincts clicking into place. "He's arrogant. He doesn't just steal. He keeps records, to prove how smart he is. To himself, mostly. You said he steals land. You said he abuses bounty laws. He'll have a book, a ledger." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "We get that ledger. We get his book of sins, and we take it to someone bigger than Sheriff Brody. We take it to the territorial marshal, to the governor. We expose him for what he is." Clara was silent for a long moment. He was offering her a choice. Not to run, not to die, but to fight, to face the serpent in his own den. She looked at the charred remains of her father's rocking chair. She nodded. "Once. All right, we get his book." The shift in her was immediate. The victim was gone. The survivor remained, but something new was forged in that fire. "A soldier. We need a plan," she said, her voice hard. "And we need guns." They made camp in a cold, rocky draw 2 miles from a ruined land. They were outlaws now, with warrants on their heads. They couldn't go to any town. "We need food," Silas said. His ribs were aching, and he was low on strength. "And I need a better weapon than a revolver." "I know a place," Clara said. "An old line cabin. Belongs to a man named Jed. He was a friend of my father's. He hates Clay. Clay stole his water rights 5 years ago. He won't help us, but he might not stop us from borrowing." They rode in the dark. The cabin was empty, just as she'd thought. Jed was probably in town. They didn't break the lock. Clara had a key, one her father had kept. Inside, they found what they needed: a bag of flour, dry jerky, coffee, and on the wall, a .44 Winchester rifle and 2 boxes of cartridges. Clara took a second revolver, a Schofield, tucking it into her own belt. "This is stealing." "Clara," Silas said, his voice quiet in the dark cabin. "No," Clara said, her hand on the rifle stock. "It's a loan, for justice. They rode back to their cold camp. For the next 2 days, they prepared. Silas, his wound healing, his strength returning, began to train her. He was no longer just her protector. He was her teacher. "You're jumpy with the revolver," he said, his voice crisp. They were in a deep arroyo, the sound of their shots muffled by the rock. "You're pulling. You're anticipating the kick. Don't aim. Just point. Look at the target and bring the gun up to your eye. Squeeze. Don't pull." She practiced over and over. Her hand, which had trembled as she held the gun, grew steady. The shot still made her jump, but her grouping on a piece of bark tightened. Then he gave her the rifle. "This is different. This is a hunting weapon. This is for distance. You rest it. You breathe. You let half your breath out, and you hold, and you squeeze." She watched him. She watched how he moved, how he checked the wind, how he read the land. She watched how his eyes were never still. She absorbed his skill, his quiet, deadly competence. She was no longer a passive passenger in her own life. She was learning to be the one who held the rifle. They forged their plan. It was simple, because simple plans had fewer moving parts. "Clay's estate is a fortress," Silas explained, drawing in the dirt with a stick. "It's 10 miles east, sits in a valley, one way in, one way out. He has high walls and guards, at least 6, 2 on the gate, 2 on the house, 2 patrol. How do we get in?" "We don't," Silas said. "Not through the gate. We go over the back wall. It's high, but it backs onto a rock slide. He thinks it's impassable. He's wrong. I've seen it. A man can climb it, if he's careful." "2 men," Clara corrected. "A man and a woman?" Silas looked at her. He didn't argue. "Once we're in," he continued. "The grounds are dark. The house is the problem. It's lit. His office. It'll be on the ground floor, near the back. A man like that wants to see his land. But he also wants a quick way out. We go in, find the office, find the book, and get out." Clara summarized. "We go in. We split up. It's faster. You're quieter. You look for the office. I'll distract any guards. Create a disturbance. Give you time to find it." Clara shook her head. "No, you're hurt, and you're the tracker. You're better at this. I'll create the disturbance." Silas stared at her. "Clara, a disturbance means lead flying. That's exactly what it is," she said, her voice hard. "You said we were equals. Stop trying to protect me. I can shoot. I can run. I can do my part. We go in together. We find the office together. If we get separated, we meet back at the rock slide. 1 hour. If the other isn't there, they go. They ride for the marshal in Cheyenne. With the book or without it. One of us has to get the story out." Silas looked at her, at the iron in her eyes. The woman he'd pulled from the mud was gone. This was someone new, someone forged in fire. He nodded. "Together." Then they rode on the 3rd night, under a sliver of moon. They left their horses a mile from the estate, tied in a box canyon, and moved the rest of the way on foot. The estate was as Silas had described. A dark, arrogant fortress in the middle of the valley. A 2-story Spanish-style main house, with lights blazing from a dozen windows. It was a beacon of power in the dark land. They moved like ghosts, Silas in the lead, Clara a shadow at his heels. They reached the back wall. It was a 12-foot stone barrier. Behind it, a steep, treacherous slide of shale and loose rock rose up into the darkness. "Easy," Silas whispered. "Test every hold. Don't trust the rock." He went first. His wound pulled, and he gritted his teeth. But he climbed. He moved with a slow, powerful grace. He reached the top, vanished over the side. Clara followed. Her hands were scraped raw, and her ankle ached, but she didn't make a sound. She pulled herself over the top and dropped silently onto the soft grass of a garden. They were in. The grounds were dark, manicured. They moved from shadow to shadow. 2 wolves in a sheep pen. They saw the guards. 2 men, smoking on the front veranda. They were relaxed, laughing. Silas led her around the back of the house, a stone patio, Tables and chairs, a row of long windows, most dark, but one, at the corner, glowed. They crept closer, hiding in a thicket of rose bushes. They could see inside. It was an office, a massive oak desk, walls lined with books, a gun rack, and a man. Nolan Clay. He was sitting at his desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand, a ledger book open in front of him. Finch, the tracker, stood opposite him. "She's with the cowboy," Finch was saying, his voice a low growl, audible through the open window. "They killed Jed and the other man. I told you we should have sent more. They're just two people. Finch." Clay's voice was smooth, bored. "One wounded cowboy and one terrified woman. They're running. They're a loose end. Nothing more. Find them. And this time, kill them both. I'm tired of the game." "Yes, sir." Finch turned and left the office. Clay sat for a moment, sipped his whiskey. Then he stood, closed the ledger, and walked to a large iron safe built into the wall. He spun the combination, opened it, and placed the book inside. He spun the dial again, locked it, and then left the room, turning the lamp down low. Silas and Clara looked at each other. The book was there, in a locked safe. "The plan's bust," Silas whispered, his face grim. "We can't open that." "The window," Clara whispered back. "It's not locked, it's just closed." "Clara, we can't." "I can," she said. "I'm smaller, quieter, I can slip in. The safe. He just closed it. The combination. Maybe it's simple. It's too much of a risk." "It's the only chance we have," she said. "Create that disturbance. Give me 5 minutes. Draw the guards away from the house." Before he could argue, she was gone, a shadow detaching from his, moving toward the window. Silas cursed, his heart pounding. She was right. It was the only way. He crept away from the house, moving toward the stables. He found what he was looking for, a barrel of lamp oil. He tipped it over, soaking the hay bales stacked nearby. He pulled a match from his pocket, struck it, and tossed it. The hay went up with a whoosh, flames leaping 20 feet into the air. A horse screamed in terror. "Fire!" a man shouted from the front of the house. "Fire at the stables!" Silas saw the two guards run from the veranda, disappearing around the corner. He slipped back into the shadows, his rifle ready. Clara heard the shouts. She didn't hesitate. She eased the tall window open, slipped inside the dark office, and closed it behind her. The room smelled of leather and tobacco. The lamp was low, casting just enough light. She moved to the safe. She put her hands on the dial. She had no idea what she was doing. She tried her birth year, 1852, nothing. She tried Arthur's, nothing. She heard boots on the patio outside. She froze, pressing herself against the wall in the shadow of a thick curtain. A guard, one she hadn't seen, peered in the window. He was looking at the fire, his back to the room. "Damn fools," he muttered, then moved on, running toward the stables. Clara let out a breath. She turned back to the safe. What would an arrogant man use? He wouldn't. He'd use something simple. She tried spinning the dial. Right, left, right. She pulled the handle. It was locked. Footsteps! In the hall, just outside the office door. She dove, not for the window, but under the massive desk. She pulled her revolver, her heart hammering so hard she was sure they could hear it. The door opened. Light spilled in. Nolan Clay walked back into the room. He was holding a pistol. He must have heard the shouts and come for his book. He walked to the safe. He spun the dial, right to 10, left to 34, right to 5. Clara watched from the shadows. She burned the numbers into her brain. 10, 34, 5. Clay opened the safe, pulled the ledger out, and tucked it under his arm. He turned to leave, just as Silas, having seen the light come on, appeared at the open window. "Clay," Silas said, his rifle level. Clay didn't flinch. He just smiled. "The cowboy. I should have known Finch was too incompetent. So you came for me?" "We came for the book," Silas said. "You came to die." Clay said, From the hall, 2 more men appeared, rifles in their hands. They had Silas trapped. "Drop the rifle, Cowboy, or my men will cut you in half." Silas hesitated. He looked at Clay. He looked at the men. He slowly, reluctantly, lowered the rifle. "Get in here," Clay ordered. Silas climbed through the window, his hands raised. "A foolish plan," Clay said, his voice conversational. He set the ledger on his desk. "And all for a whore who isn't worth $5. Where is she? I know you weren't alone." "She's gone," Silas lied. "A pity." Clay nodded to his men. "He killed 2 of my men. Beat him, find out where she went, then put a bullet in him and dump him with the horses." The 2 men moved in. They were big. They grabbed Silas, disarming him, shoving him to his knees. The first one hit him, a hard, brutal punch to his wounded ribs. Silas gasped, collapsing. The second man kicked him. Clara watched from under the desk. Her hand clamped over her mouth. They were going to kill him. He had come back for her, and now they were going to beat him to death at her feet. The man kicked him again. Silas grunted, curling into a ball. Her hand was on her revolver, her father's gun. "Squeeze! Don't pull!" She slid out from under the desk. Clay was watching his men work, a look of bored satisfaction on his face. "Get away from him," Clara said. Her voice was low, and it was shaking, but it cut through the room. The 2 men stopped. They turned. Clay turned. His eyes widened, first in surprise, then in pure, delighted malice. "Clara," he said, his voice a silky caress. "You came. How wonderful. You saved me the trouble of hunting you down." She had the revolver leveled, not at Clay, at the man closest to Silas. "I said, get away from him," the man laughed. "Or what, little lady? You'll shoot me." He took a step toward her. Clara pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the small room. The man staggered, a look of stunned surprise on his face. He looked down at the red flower blooming on his chest, and then he fell. The second man raised his rifle. Silas, seeing his chance, surged up from the floor. He tackled the man at the knees, driving him backward into the wall. The rifle went off, the bullet burying itself in the ceiling. It was just Clay. He stared at Clara, his smile gone, replaced by a cold fury. He still had his pistol. "You bitch!" he hissed, and raised his gun. He was aiming at her. "No!" Silas roared. He had just gotten to his feet. He saw the gun. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't hesitate. He lunged. Not at Clay's gun, but at Clay, covering Clara's body with his own. Clay fired. The sound was flat, ugly. Silas was thrown backward, as if punched. A new, dark hole appearing high on his chest, much higher than the last wound. He hit the floor and lay still. Clara screamed. It was a raw, primal sound of pure loss. Clay was still standing, his pistol smoking. He looked at Silas on the floor, then at Clara. His smile returned. "Now," he said, taking a step toward her. "We can finally finish our business." Clara raised her revolver. She had been aiming at the first man. She had been pointing. This was different. She looked at Nolan Clay. She looked at Silas, unmoving, blood pooling on the floor. She aimed, and she squeezed. The bullet took Clay in the center of his chest. He looked down, a look of profound, almost comical surprise on his face. He looked back at her. He tried to speak. A gout of blood came from his mouth. He fell, crashing across his own desk, scattering his papers. The room was silent. Smoke hung thick in the air. The fire outside, forgotten, crackled. Clara stood, the heavy revolver still in her hand. The man she had shot was dead. Clay was dead. She dropped the gun. It clattered on the floorboards. "Silas!" She ran to him, falling to her knees, skidding in his blood. He was on his back, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The wound was high, on his shoulder, near the neck. Blood, dark and arterial, pumped from it. "Silas!" she sobbed, pressing her hands to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "No, no, no, no! Don't you leave me! Don't you dare leave me!" His eyes flickered. He looked at her. He tried to speak. A bloody bubble formed on his lips. I didn't run, he whispered. You didn't run? She cried, pressing down, the hot blood covering her hands. You stayed. Stay with me. Please, Silas, stay. His eyes rolled back. His body went slack. She screamed his name, her voice echoing in the dead man's house. He was alive, but barely. Her scream echoed in the opulent, smoky room. It was a sound of final, ragged loss. But the time for grief was a luxury she did not have. He was bleeding. He was dying. She ripped her gaze from his face, from the bloody hole near his neck, and her eyes fell on the ledger. It was still on the desk, under Nolan Clay's arm. She shoved his body off it, grabbed the heavy book, and threw it into her own saddlebag, which she'd dropped by the window. Then she was back at Silas's side, ripping strips from the hem of her own shirt, wadding the cloth, pressing it hard against the pumping wound. Stay with me, Silas, she commanded, her voice a low, fierce growl. You do not get to die. Not now. She had to get him out. She couldn't carry him. She ran to the desk, found the whiskey bottle Clay had been drinking, and ran back. She poured a river of it onto the wound. He didn't even flinch. He was too far gone. She poured more onto a cloth and pressed it against the wound, a crude, burning bandage. She heard the shouts outside, louder now. The fire at the stable was a raging inferno. The distraction he had created for her was now her only salvation. She grabbed his arm, pulling him. Silas, help me. You have to help me. He was a dead weight. She couldn't move him. She put her revolver to his temple, her hand shaking. Silas, I swear to God, if you die here, I will shoot you again. Get up! Get up! His eyes flickered. A spark. He saw the gun. He saw her face, contorted in a mask of terror and rage. He groaned, a sound from the grave. Clara! Now! She screamed. He found his feet, or she found them for him. She hauled him up, his arm draped over her shoulder, his entire weight threatening to crush her. He was half conscious, his boots dragging, leaving a smear of blood on the expensive rugs. She dragged him to the window, through it, and onto the patio. The night was chaos. Men were shouting, running with buckets from the well toward the blazing stable. No one was watching the house. No one cared about the gunshots. They were saving the horses. Our horses? She panted, dragging him across the manicured lawn, back toward the rock slide, back toward the wall. Silas, you have to climb. He just looked at her, his eyes dull. She knew he couldn't. She propped him against the stone wall, his head lolling. Stay here. Don't move. Don't die. She ran, alone, back to the stable. It was pandemonium. She saw Finch, his face black with soot, directing the men. She slipped past them, into the chaos of the burning building, the air thick with smoke and the smell of fear. She found her mare and his roan, tied where the stable hands had moved them. She cut them loose, slapped them hard on the rump, sending them galloping out of the burning barn and into the darkness of the grounds. Then she ran back to Silas. She found the horses at the far end of the garden, grazing nervously. She brought them to the wall. Getting him on the horse was the hardest thing she had ever done. He was an anchor, a body of lead. She somehow, with pure, desperate strength, hauled him up, slinging him face down over the roan's saddle like a sack of feed. He moaned, a long, low sound of agony. She mounted her mare, grabbed the roan's reins, and kicked. She rode, not for the gate, but for the dark. Open range, crashing through a low hedge. A man shouted. A rifle fired, the bullet whining over her head, but they were gone. Two shadows swallowed by the night. She rode for an hour, pushing the horses, until she was high in the hills above Medicine Creek. She didn't dare go to the town, not to the hotel, not with a wanted man, bleeding to death. She remembered a place, a barn, on the far edge of town, set back from the road, belonging to an old German woodcarver named Schmidt. She had helped him restore it 2 years ago. After a windstorm, he was a quiet man, a friend of her father's. He kept to himself. She found it, a sturdy, clean barn, smelling of cedar and fresh hay. She half dragged, half carried Silas inside, laying him on a pile of clean straw. He was pale, his breathing a shallow, wet rattle. The cloth on his chest was soaked black. She left him. She ran into the town, keeping to the shadows. She went to the small house of Dr. Hallowell. He was an old man, cynical, and drunk half the time. But he was the only man in town who had never taken $1 from Nolan Clay. She banged on his door. He opened it, a robe thrown over his nightshirt, a glass of laudanum in his hand. "Mrs. Miller? What in God's name?" "It's Silas," she panted. "He's been shot. He's in Schmidt's barn. You have to come. Please, he's dying." The doctor looked at her, at the blood and soot covering her. He saw the wildness in her eyes. "I've heard the talk, Mrs. Miller." "About you and that cowboy, about the warrants. Nolan Clay is dead," she said, her voice flat. "I killed him. Now, are you coming, or am I dragging you?" Hallowell stared. He lowered his glass. "Schmidt's barn. You said?" He worked by the light of a single, flickering lantern. He'd brought his black bag. He'd kicked Clara out of the stall, telling her to boil water. When she came back, Silas was unconscious, his shirt cut away. The doctor was probing the wound. His hands, surprisingly, rock steady. "He's lucky," the doctor muttered, his voice low. An inch to the left, it would have shattered his collarbone. An inch lower, it would have gone straight into his lung. As it is, it tore the artery, but it missed the big one. It's the blood loss. He has almost none left. He worked for an hour. He tied off the bleeder, his stitches small and neat. He dug out the .44 slug, dropped it with a tink into a metal bowl. He bandaged the wound tightly. "He's alive," Hallowell said, standing, wiping his hands on a rag, "which is more than he deserves, by the look of it. Now it's up to him. And God, the fever will come. If he survives that, he might just make it." Clara sank to her knees, her legs finally giving out. "You'd best get out of here. Mrs. Miller," the doctor said, packing his bag. "The sheriff will be looking for you." Clara looked up, her face hard in the lantern light. "I have one more stop to make." She walked into the sheriff's office at dawn. Sheriff Brody was at his desk, his face pale, nursing a cup of coffee. He'd heard about the fire. He'd heard about the gunshots. He looked up and saw her, covered in drying blood, her eyes like two burned holes in a blanket. He reached for his gun. Clara tossed the heavy ledger onto his desk. It landed with a sound like a gavel. "What's this?" he whispered. "That," Clara said, her voice a hoarse rasp, "is Nolan Clay's entire life. It's every rancher he ever cheated, every bounty he ever faked, every man he ever had killed, including my husband. It's all in there. His accident is on page 42. Brody stared at the book as if it were a snake. "Nolan Clay is dead," Clara said, her voice echoing in the small, quiet room. "The men who attacked me in the alley are dead. The men who were in his office are dead. I killed them, all of them." Brody's hand was shaking. He was a bought man, but his owner was dead. "I know your name is in that book. Sheriff," Clara said, her voice dropping. "I saw it. A payment of $100. For the warrants on me and Silas." Brody went white. "Now you have a choice." Clara said, "You can arrest me. You can try to hang me. And I will make sure this book is read, in open court, by the territorial judge. And your name will be the first one I say. Or you can do your job. For the first time, you can take that book to Judge Miller. You can clear the warrants. And you can let justice, real justice, finally come to this valley." She didn't wait for an answer. She turned, walked out of the office, and disappeared into the gray morning light. Sheriff Brody stared at the ledger. He was sweating. He opened it. He saw his name. He saw all the other names. He closed it, his hands trembling. He picked up the book and walked, very slowly, to the judge's house. The news hit Medicine Creek like a lightning strike. Nolan Clay was dead. Clara Miller, the widow everyone had whispered about, had killed him, and she had the proof. The town, so long strangled by Clay's power, took its first Shuddering breath. People gathered on the street. Ranchers who had been cheated, families who had been run off their land. They all started talking. The fear was broken. When Finch and the last of Clay's hired guns rode into town, bruised and angry, they didn't find a sympathetic sheriff. They found a mob. The town turned. The men who had been predators were now prey. Sheriff Brody, seeing which way the wind was blowing, and with the judge at his back, arrested Finch and 2 others for the murder in the canyon. The rest of Clay's men scattered, vanishing into the hills, their power broken overnight. Clara heard none of this. She was in the barn. For 2 weeks. She did not leave. She sat in the hay by Silas's side. Old Schmidt brought her food, water, and fresh bandages. Leaving them by the stall door without a word, Silas burned. The fever came, just as the doctor had said. He thrashed, his body on fire. He was back in the panhandle, screaming Eliza's name. He cried out for the boy, his voice raw with a guilt that was being burned clean. Clara was there for all of it. She held him down. She bathed his face with cool water. She whispered to him, her voice a low, constant murmur. She talked about the mountains, about clear water, about a place where no one had a name. She willed him to live. She had fought for his life, and she would not lose him now. On the 15th day, the fever broke. She woke to find him watching her. His eyes were clear. The ghost was gone. He was just a man, a very thin, very scarred man. He tried to speak. His voice was a dry croak. "Water," she said, and helped him drink. He lay back, his eyes tracing her face. He saw the exhaustion, the soot still under her fingernails. "You stayed," he whispered. She nodded, her throat tight. "Why?" he rasped. "I ran in the hotel. I left you. You came back," she said. "I'm a killer. Clara, cursed." "So am I," she said, and she showed him her hands, the nicks and scrapes from the fight, the faint, faded bloodstains she couldn't seem to wash out. He reached up, his hand weak, and touched her face. "You should have let me die. I'm a wanted man." "The warrants are gone," she said, her voice quiet. "The ledger, it's done. Clay is done. It's over." He absorbed this. He closed his eyes. "You should have gone. Why did you stay?" Clara leaned down, her forehead resting against his. She smelled the straw, and his sweat, and the faint, clean scent of the lye soap she'd used to clean his wounds. "We collided. Silas," she whispered, her lips brushing his dry ones. "And I'd do it again." He didn't have the strength to kiss her. He just closed his eyes. And for the first time in 2 years, he slept, a real healing sleep. Summer turned to fall. Silas healed. The wound was deep, and it would always ache when the weather turned. Another mark on his body. But it healed. He regained his strength. Walking in the small pasture behind Schmidt's barn, the town left them alone. The judge had quietly burned the warrants. Clara Miller was a local legend. Some said she was a righteous avenger. Some said she was a cold-blooded killer. No one said it to her face. Her homestead was gone. The bank, which had held the note for Clay, foreclosed on the ashes. There was nothing left for her in Medicine Creek. There was nothing left for either of them. When the first snows touched the high peaks, Silas was strong enough to ride. He and Clara saddled the horses. She had her mare. He had his roan. They were all that was left of the collision. They rode out of town at dawn. They didn't look back. They didn't head north, into the lands he'd been running to. They headed west, toward the high, shining mountains, toward the empty, unknown territory where the maps were blank. They rode for a month, until the last trace of the valley was a distant memory. They found a place, high up, a small, protected bowl of land with a stream that ran clean and cold, and a stand of tall pines. They built a cabin. It wasn't a homestead. It was a fortress of their own, small and simple, with thick walls and one door. They cut the trees themselves, Silas's strength returning with every swing of the axe. Clara chinked the logs, her hands growing rough and capable. They built it to withstand the winter. They built it to last. The winter was hard, But they had each other. They had a fire, and the food they had hunted. They were two people in a vast, white silence. They learned each other. Not in the desperate, shared pain of the past, but in the quiet, slow moments of a shared life. Spring came. The world returned. They fished for trout in the stream. Silas built a small fence for the horses. Clara planted a tiny garden with seeds she'd bought in a town 50 miles south. They talked, but the silence was just as good. They had no ghosts. They had just found a quiet place to heal. At night, they touched. It was not the desperate, raw coupling of the way station, or the tender solace of the hotel room. It was not the reverent, defiant act in the ruined church. It was just touch. His hand on her waist as they cooked, her head on his shoulder as they watched the fire. It was slow. It was known. It was quiet. And it was, finally, love. One evening, as the air grew crisp with the promise of the next winter, Clara was sitting on the small porch they had built. The sun was setting, turning the entire western sky into a blaze of orange and purple. She was looking at something in her hand, a single, dried bluebell, a fragile, paper-thin thing she had found in the ashes of her old life, tucked inside a tin box that had somehow survived the fire. She heard him come up behind her. He didn't have to make a sound. She just knew. He had been chopping wood for the winter. He was strong again, solid. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on the top of her head. He smelled of pine and cold air. He said nothing, just held her, the two of them watching the day die. She leaned her head back against his shoulder. "We're still crashing, you know," she whispered, her voice a quiet murmur in the vast silence. She felt him smile against her hair. He kissed her neck, a slow, warm kiss that sent a shiver through her, a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. "Then let's crash again tonight," he said. "Thank you for listening to this story. We truly hope you enjoyed this tale from the American West. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment and let us know. Your thoughts mean a great deal, so please share them in English. And if you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories like this one.